Good afternoon and welcome to the Easter Seals Project Action Webinar, Local Policy Development, Ensuring Your Transportation Service is Accessible and Open to All. All participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be an opportunity to ask questions during today's presentation. At that time, an operator will give instructions on how to ask your question. If you should need assistance during the conference, please signal an operator by pressing star then 0 on your touchtone phone. This conference is being recorded. I would now like to turn the conference over to Rick Upstelton. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie, and welcome everyone to today's session on local policy development. We will be discussing best practices for developing policies that can help you to ensure that your transportation services are accessible to riders with disabilities. But before we begin, I'd like to get a couple of housekeeping notes out of the way. I will start with mentioning that it appears that there might be some slowness in our internet connection today. As a result, we have prompted everyone, if they would like to download the slides we will be following today. You will have seen that link appear recently on your screens. Also, you can dial in over the phone to hear this audio if you are having any problems experiencing hearing the audio through your computer screen speakers. You will have also been sent yesterday in the connection information how to find the presentation online, but again, it has been also provided for you through this link. As Stephanie mentioned, today's event is being recorded and will be transcribed. You'll also be able to visit our website, which again is projectaction.org, in about 30 days' time to download a written copy of that transcript. If you would need that copy in Braille or audio CD format, you can email us a request to webinars@easterseals.com, and just be sure to give your postal address. Closed captioning is being made available for today's event. In order to access the captioning, please go to the link that should soon appear on the screen. You can click directly onto that link. This will create a second window, which you may want to then minimize so that you can view both the captioning and PowerPoint together. Today's presenters are Christian Barreca, a Training and Technical Assistance Specialist here at Project Action, as well as Kristen McLaughlin, also a Training and Technical Assistance Specialist here. And joining them is Pat Hansen, the Executive Director of South Central Adult Services in North Dakota. I would, before we begin, like to take a moment also to remind everyone that Easter Seals Project Action is a technical assistance center. We strive to provide accurate information on the Americans with Disabilities Act. What we provide in these forums is technical assistance and not legal advice. In other words, it does not carry the full force of the law. We aim to provide solutions that use the ADA and occasionally other federal regulations as a baseline to addressing situations. With that caveat, we will get started. So I would like to turn the presentation over to Christian Barreca.
Thank you so much, Rick, for that great introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today to speak with you about these issues of local policy development. This is something that often comes up as a part of Project Action's work. We are an ADA Technical Assistance Center, as Rick mentioned just now, and we often spend time doing a lot of events and organizing a lot of trainings around ADA issues and trying to familiarize the public transportation community with ADA regulations as they pertain to transportation services. But what often comes up is the question of what is a regulation for the ADA versus what is a local policy? What's the difference there? How do I, as a transit provider or transportation service provider, make that distinction? And we've come to realize over the years that we don't always do a great job of really illuminating that point to the community. So that's the intention with this webinar today, and we're very glad that you can join us to discuss these issues. And later on, as Rick mentioned, we will be having a question and answer session, and we look forward to getting some feedback from you as to how these issues play out in your community. So to give you a quick outline of what we're going to be discussing today, first I'm going to sort of quickly gloss over the ADA requirements that we often discuss, and then set us up for a discussion of how local policy figures in. That's going to include a discussion of why local policy is extremely important, basically the why of why we're here today. Then Christy's going to walk us through some steps for policy development. So our goal there is to kind of provide you with a step-by-step process for addressing an issue in your community pertaining to accessible transportation and developing a policy that will help your service be more accessible to the members of your community who are in the riding public. And then we're also going to spend a little bit of time discussing areas for policy development. So policy can be a very sort of nebulous term, so we're going to talk more about exactly which aspects of public transportation different accessibility policies might apply to. And then we're going to discuss some follow-up considerations for how to develop policies and when different circumstances might arise. And then we're going to, our guest presenter, Pat Hansen, is going to discuss the policy development process in her local agency. So we're very happy to have Pat on the line for that. All right. So the ADA is it's the Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. So what that means in terms of public transportation services is the ADA guarantees access to all people with disabilities to their local transportation services. It also sets forth requirements for what would constitute non-discrimination. So in other words, what that means is the ADA, it gives a general guideline for saying this is when you might be entering into a discriminatory practice. What it kind of does is it draws a line in a very general sense because every community is a little bit different. The services being offered in every community are a little different, and there's different populations using them. So in terms of public transit, the local policy becomes very important because it takes what the ADA says about non-discrimination and about guaranteeing access, and it sort of makes it more specific to that individual community. So it takes into account the characteristics of your transportation services and with the different considerations you have at the local level. So for instance, the extent of your service area, how many routes you might have, what types of services you're providing, and it creates policies that are very specific to that landscape. And it kind of helps bring that very general sense of open access that the ADA has into a context where both the transit personnel and the transit consumers or riders can kind of digest that and understand their rights and their responsibilities. So the ADA, it does say what a transportation provider must do in terms of providing access. So it gives it gives regulations in a general sense in terms of vehicle accessibility, stop accessibility, things like that. It doesn't say how to go about doing these things. So a great example is the ADA says you have to allow someone with a service animal to board the vehicle, but it doesn't always go into what a kind of more local issue might be. So for instance, it won't say, well, if it's not a service animal, what do you do? It won't have it doesn't say too much about service animal conduct on the bus, things like that. So those are all issues that become part of local policy, and they're things that are specific to your community. So what policies ultimately do is they set forth the expectations for both customers and personnel about how these non-discrimination requirements that are set up at that sort of federal level, how they can be met on a day-to-day basis in your community. So there are three general policy categories and that's kind of the framework within which we're going to be working today. The first is and this is kind of the most basic, is just a statement of compliance with the ADA, and that is a transit agency giving a statement saying that yes, these are the ADA regulations. Our services are in line with these ADA regulations, and that's an important baseline, certainly. But there are policies that sort of go more in depth. So for instance, the second category is policies that outline instructions on how to use the system. So that can often be a bit more of a ride guide than a policy, but it's not just a ride guide because it does lay out what customers can be guaranteed and what their responsibilities are on transit. Public transportation, after all, is a public good. It's important to remember that part of it. And there are certain things that are guaranteed to riders, and certain other things that they're sort of responsible for, such as conduct. And this level of this category of policy is very important for delineating those and making those known to the riding public. And then the third category are detailed policies, and they outline the expected actions for both customers and personnel. So that's sort of what I started mentioning in the previous slide. And that's something that really we're going to be focusing more on today, how to develop those policies, how to determine that they're necessary in the first place, who to kind of bring in for developing them, and what that process looks like. And just a quick note here, regardless of the type of policy you have, the information has to be provided to passengers when it might impact the level of service that they're going to be receiving. So an example here, and you'll see this up on the slide, is for instance, if a customer is applying for paratransit eligibility is denied, then or determined ineligible, and then something that would have to be provided is your local policy for the appeals procedure. And that's just a great example of how there is a service out there that the customer would like to use. They apply for it, it doesn't work out. What is their recourse? And part of the local policy issue is making sure that all the information someone needs is readily available to them in a variety of formats. So for instance, making it available online, making it available through a customer service helpline, anything that individual would need to help them better access your transportation services needs to be made available in such a way that they don't necessarily have to seek it out. So in this example, if the person is being informed they've been deemed ineligible at that juncture, then you would want to actually provide them with the policy for an appeals procedure. Moving on to some best practices and thinking about, this is getting more into the area of policy development. Policies that address the how part of providing transportation services, those need to be developed with many different parties at the table. So what you need is the riding public there. Oftentimes we have found that there is not enough input from riders with disabilities into policies that directly affect their travel experience. So making sure that their voices are heard. And Eastern Seals Project Action has developed resources around including people with disabilities in the planning process. And that's something that we're happy to share with you if you have more interest about that. It's also important to make sure that kind of what transit personnel need and what their kind of how policies impact them is also a consideration. So getting these two different groups to communicate with one another and jointly form a policy assures a greater rate of success at developing a policy that's going to be agreeable with all parties concerned. Also, modifications to policies that oftentimes need to be considered. A policy should especially when it comes to providing service to individuals with disabilities, policies cannot be completely set in stone. There is a requirement for a reasonable modification that Christy is going to go into a little bit more depth on later in the presentation. But for now, if you have a policy, a local policy that might in any way be considered discriminatory or might prevent someone with a disability from using your services, you have to consider that requirement for reasonable modification to the policy to open up the service to that individual. You also need to make sure that you're using a systematic approach that develops policies with all the various stakeholders concerned, as I mentioned earlier. Also that it is a systematic approach, that policy development follows a certain process in your community so that when it's time to develop a new policy or amend an existing policy, there's a procedure you can turn to, and that all parties concerned know and are aware of what that procedure is so that they can stay included in the process. That's often also overlooked, and it unfortunately can often lead to inconsistent policy development. So that's certainly something to be avoided. It's also extremely important to update policies as issues arise. It's the whole policy amending policies area, and it's something that it's good to realize that policies are not completely static. They can change. Circumstances around which you're providing your services can change. So, for instance, if routes are added, policies might need to be changed. Different circumstances like that. And then finally, before I turn it over to Christy, I just want to quickly go through different ways to get riders involved in your policy development. Probably the #1 way is the use of riders advisory boards. So that's riders councils, groups of concerned riders, and most communities will have a, depending on the size of the transit system, will have a certain size group that meets regularly and discusses their experience using the system and any changes they would like to see made, and taking that input into consideration in your policy development practices. It's also very important to seek input from the different disability service agencies that represent your community. Oftentimes, people with disabilities play a huge role in the community. They're part of the a large part of the community, and they are oftentimes people with disabilities are a huge segment of your riding public. And so making sure that you are in regular touch with the different organizations that that population is keyed into and that represents persons with disabilities can really help you stay connected to that group and stay connected to the different issues that are most important to them. Contacting customers with disabilities at large is important, and that's something there's interesting discussions to be had in terms of how to go about doing that. So are those electronic communications? Are those ads that are put up in bus shelters? Are those different notices that you're handing out of public hearings? Things like that. There's a whole variety of different ways, but again, I just want to reiterate the point that the huge variety of riders you have out there, making sure that you're getting in touch with them, staying aware of their needs, staying aware of their views on your different policies and on your services is one of the best ways that you can ensure you're providing the best service possible to your riding public. And then the last item is just holding focus groups, regular focus groups where you're inviting members of the community in and asking for their honest and open feedback on the service they're receiving. People count on your services to access their work, access doctor's appointments, access school, access social events. It is oftentimes, depending on where they live, their main, if not main, then only way of getting places. And so making sure that you're open to receiving their feedback and open to considering that feedback when changing or developing policies to make sure that those are the customers that you are serving the best is extremely important. So with that basic outline of policy development and best practices for development, I want to turn it over to Christy so she can give us a better idea of what a process might look like.
All right, thank you, Christian. I just want to start off by saying quickly that the process that I'm going to explain to you is not in any way an absolute requirement for transit agencies. We provide this process as more of a general overview of how a transit agency might develop and or amend their transit policies and practices. And so this is a suggested method that agencies might use, but I didn't want anybody to think that this is a regulatory requirement as far as the process itself. So having said that, what I'm going to do is to present this process that you can use, and certainly we invite you to use it and to develop and amend your policies in this way. As you all know, every transit system is occasionally faced with either developing and or amending their current policies to address some sort of service issue. And so when this type of service issue arises, managers are usually notified through one or more of many ways that could include customer feedback, regular data reporting, reports from bus operators, from other management such as street supervisors or dispatchers. And when this occurs, transit managers need to first identify the problem causing the service issue, and then they can address that problem. And addressing that may include updating or amending their current policy. And so there are several problem-solving techniques, and this is actually step one in developing or amending your policy, and that is to determine the cause of the problem. There are several problem-solving techniques out there. We have included here on this slide the steps for one of these methods. If you have a method that you use that is different from this, that is fine as well. Again, just a suggested method for determining the cause of the problem. And this includes figuring out exactly what the challenge is. So the first thing that you need to do here, step one, is to define the challenge. This includes determining what information you already know, determining who needs to be involved to address the challenge, and determining the intended outcome for each person and or group involved. So that's step one of determining the cause of the problem. Step two to determining the cause of the problem is collecting information. So you need to, in this step, determine what information you need to collect. Where is the problem happening? When is it happening? How is it happening? Who is it happening to? And so on. And then you need to determine the method of collecting the information, whether this is going to be through emails, telephone calls, face-to-face, so on. And then the last part of this step two is to determine from whom or what to collect the information. So, you know, were there other passengers involved in the situation? Were there operators involved? Are there existing evaluation tools or service data that you might use to get the information? And so step two is really collecting all of the information that you need about the service issue that you're encountering. Step three is to establish the facts. Obviously, this would include sort of corroborating information from all of the sources that you've received data from. So it's important in this case to include information from passengers, from operators, from management, from all of the groups in which you've collected your information. Step four here is to draw valid conclusions. This is important in this step is to be aware of your role in the situation. How you approach the challenge may affect how you perceive the challenge. So for example, if you're stressed out, then you're going to perceive the challenge differently than if you were calm or were having an easy day, so to speak. So consider your state when you're trying to draw your conclusions. Also, don't react to information given to you until you have a complete understanding of the situation. You really want to get all the facts in before you react in any way. Acknowledge any potential bias. That's obviously very important. If you're getting information from someone that you've had issues with in the past, that may bias you to the information they're bringing to you. So just acknowledge that and consider that when you're trying to draw your conclusion. And then obviously, as I've mentioned, consider all available and pertinent information. That's very important in drawing conclusions when trying to figure out what your problem is and what to do about it. Step five in determining the cause of your problem is to generate solutions. One great way to start doing this is to brainstorm possible solutions. And when you're brainstorming, there's no wrong answer. You just put as many ideas out there as you can and then come back to them and see which one might be a good solution to the problem. This is also a good time to look at promising practices that are happening in the industry. What are other agencies doing about similar problems? This is something that if you're encountering this or trying to figure this out at home, this is something that we at Project Action can help you figure out. So if you want to know what the best practices are or what other agencies are doing, feel free to contact us and we can try to help you through that. And you also want to, as you're generating solutions, make sure that the solution is reasonable. Incremental changes may be necessary. So it may be a case where you want to make a small change versus a big change, because a big change would be too much of a hardship on the passengers and the operators and management and so on. So small changes may be necessary. And also make sure to discuss possible solutions with all of the people involved. And again, that list could include passengers, operators, management. Might also include advisory committees if you have any, and the community at large as well. Step 6 to determining the cause of the problem is selecting and implementing an approach to the challenge. So as I've mentioned in almost every step, it's very important to include all of the people involved. This is a theme that sort of runs throughout. And then consider the solutions when you're selecting an approach. Which approach is available for immediate implementation? That's important to know. Which solution might be best for a long-term policy change? Do you have the resources for implementation? And that's important to consider when you're selecting your solution. Is there any risk involved in the implementation of the approach that you want to select? And do you have the time to implement this approach? Can it be implemented quickly? Is it going to take longer? So on. And then also included in step 6 would be to create an action plan for implementation. So set out very specific steps that you'll follow when you're implementing the change that you've decided on. And then a very important part also included in step 6 is to publicize the decision. It's very important because if you don't do that, people aren't going to know what decision you've made. They're not going to know how to follow it, and then therefore the policy is not going to be very effective. And then finally, in the general problem-solving process that we've laid out here, step 7 is to evaluate the success and refine the approach. So you're going to see how successful your plan is, and then make changes as necessary. And so this is all within, I know it's a big step, but step 1 is very important, determining the cause of the problem that you're having. And as a part of step 1, you may determine that amending or developing policy is the way in which you're going to address the concerns. And so if you decide that you're going to be amending and or developing policy, then you're going to go on to step 2, which is to develop a draft of the new policy or a revised version of the policy you already have in effect. And so what you want to do with this step is you want to use the feedback that you gathered during step 1 and draft the new policy or amend the existing policy, whichever is needed. Using that feedback from step 1 is just essential because it's going to make that draft or the new policy better from the beginning. It's going to be more effective from the beginning. Also, as a part of step 2, it's important at this point that you be aware of and review, if necessary, the current ADA regulations and any state or local requirements that you have that might affect the area that you're amending the policy in. So, for example, Christian had talked about what the ADA requirements are and that they are a minimum and that's what has to be, that's the minimum that has to be held in different areas for transit. And so when you're creating or amending a policy, you certainly want to be aware of what those minimums are so that you can make sure that you're compliant with the ADA, which is very important. So after step 2, step 3 is going to be a review of the policy. So you want to review the draft policy. It may be necessary at that point to go and have legal counsel review the policy. I know a big concern among a lot of people that work in transit are liability issues. And so you want to, if you feel it necessary, and it's certainly something I would suggest, is to review any amended or newly developed policies with your legal counsel. It's also good to solicit input from affected parties. So, if this policy is going to affect drivers, or if it's going to affect passengers, or the community, or whatever the case may be, having them review this policy and provide feedback is really important. Having their buy-in and their input is going to make the implementation of the policy a much more smooth process. So step 4 is to make final revisions. So whatever feedback you get from passengers or drivers or advisory committees or whatever the case may be, take that information and use it to make a final revision of the either new policy or amended policy. It's not a requirement that you include every bit of feedback when you revise your policy, but at least taking it into consideration and trying to find a way that you feel would work best for the community and for your agency is going to obviously make the policy even better. So take the feedback that you've received and make the final revisions on the draft policy. Step 5 is going to be to inform the customers of the new policy. This is actually a really crucial step. Passengers can't follow a policy that they're not aware of. And so it's important if you make a change or if you create a new policy that information is provided to the passengers or to the drivers or whatever the case may be. As Christian mentioned, there are certain times when it's a requirement to provide policy information to passengers. So for example, the example he gave was for paratransit. And if someone is denied eligibility for paratransit, it's actually a requirement that they receive the agency's policy on appealing that decision. And so in certain cases, depending on what policy you're looking at, it's even a requirement by law to provide that information. And of course, the last bullet point, always important to provide information in alternate formats if needed or upon request. So that could include large print or braille or whatever the need would be. So step 6 is to implement the new or updated policy. That seems to flow quite well from the last step. And so this would include training of operators or management, and obviously just going through with the change that was made in the policy itself. It's good, of course not required, but good to have a timeline for implementation, and then following that timeline and monitoring your progress until the services are fully adapted to the policy is also great. It helps the passengers know what to expect, and drivers as well, and then people can be sort of up to date on what the new requirements are. And then finally, for step 7, it is to follow up and evaluate the new policy that you put into place. This really just sort of might reinforce that the updated policy is really working for you. One thing about updating and amending policy, it really is an ongoing process. It's not something that you just do once. And so following up on the changes that you've made, evaluating whether or not they have addressed the initial concern that you had or the initial problem that you were experiencing is really important. So you want to make sure that the policy is working for you, and it could be the case that somewhere down the road you may need to revisit this policy and complete these steps again, because again it's an ongoing process and it might need to be done several times throughout the year. So follow-up and evaluation, very important. And then if necessary, if you find that the policy is not working in the way that you had wanted it to, amending that policy again might be necessary. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, that's actually the sort of suggested process that we have for amending or developing new policy. But I also want to go through some of the areas that as a transit agency you might be considering either updating or developing policy around. This is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just some of the areas that we receive questions on most with regard to policy. So you may be experiencing a policy issue in other areas, but again, this is sort of these are the areas that we get the most questions about. So the first is wheelchair securement. The transit agencies the right to decide whether or not they want to have every person's wheelchair secured to the vehicle, or if they will only secure wheelchairs upon request. And so this is a local policy decision. And most fixed route agencies already have that decision determined and in place. Of course, they could possibly revise that policy if there's an issue that comes up. But this is an area where it's a little confusing in that it is a local policy decision. They have the choice as to which way to go. There are also some little points of policy that might come up. So, for example, securing other mobility aids other than wheelchairs. Do you secure walkers? How do you secure segways if those are used? Do you have a policy with regard to stowing walkers or things like that? So a lot of those sort of minute details are left up to local policy, and so really important to work that out and figure out what the best policy is for your local community. Next is reduced fare programs. These, there is a requirement to provide a reduced fare program for fixed route, but there are other ways in which you could adjust this policy. Some agencies provide more than the minimum that they're required as far as a reduced fare program. Some agencies provide free rides on fixed route for paratransit eligible passengers. That's obviously above and beyond what's required in a reduced fare program. So there are some points of policy development that might appear in those types of programs as well. Stop announcements. There is obviously a minimum here for what the ADA requires needs to be called out. But there are, again, some points of policy that agencies may consider, such as what happens if the driver is not calling the stops and somebody misses their stop. What happens then? Is there a policy in place for if there's an automated announcement and that's not working? What are the operator's responsibilities for somebody that both cannot see or hear? Is there anything in place? Is there a procedure that person is to follow? So there are, again, some points of policy that can be figured out with regard to stop announcements. Origin to destination. This is a term used in paratransit often. It's actually in the regulations in paratransit that that service must be provided from origin to destination. In general, most transit agencies define that as a curb-to-curb service. But the STA has provided some guidance on that and said that depending on the person's disability, if they need the service to be door-to-door, then that's what must be provided instead of just curb-to-curb. But above and beyond that minimum requirement, agencies could also consider providing door-through-door service or hand-to-hand service, and those are services that people, depending on their disability, could help them to travel with paratransit a little bit more independently. But again, those are above and beyond what the ADA requires and would be points of local policy. And then finally, the eligibility determination process. That is, it is required in the ADA that paratransit have some sort of eligibility determination process, but the how to do that is left up to agencies, and their particular local policy could include things like either interviews or in-person assessments or things like that. So, the actual how-to in the case of eligibility determination is left up to local areas to decide how they want to create their policy for that. So the next slide, it's something that's pretty important to know with regard to policy. It's hard to discuss policy without talking about when you might make a reasonable modification to your policy. Disability rights law has for a long time held that reasonable modifications should be made to policy and practice to ensure that there's no discrimination for people with disabilities. So the actual regulations are listed there on the screen for you from Section 35.130. And the idea is that if because of a person's disability they need for a modification to be made to your policy or practice, and that request is a reasonable request, then you should be making that for the person. And we'll talk about some examples, which are on the next slide, to some of the reasonable modifications that you may be requested to make. So for example, the first example is a transit agency policy states that operators cannot assist with fare. And for fixed route operators, that's pretty common, that the transit agency does not want a person to, or a driver to assist with the fare for a passenger. The reasonable modification, however, if the person, if the passenger has a disability that prevents them from independently paying their fare, then it may be an acceptable reasonable modification for the driver to then help that person. And that could include either if the person has their bus pass around their neck, the driver may be able to help put that onto the Smart Trip or the fare box so that their fare is then paid. If that is not something that the agency is comfortable allowing the driver to do, another option for making a reasonable modification is to waive their fare for that particular ride. We've heard of we've heard of agencies going both ways with a reasonable modification in that case. And then another example of reasonable modification is the administering medication or providing a breathing treatment as a fundamental alteration to service. So for example, if your agency has the policy where the driver does not help with oxygen tanks or any type of treatment or anything like that, not treatment itself, but with any equipment as far as medical equipment or something like that, a reasonable modification might be that the driver provides some type of assistance with that type of equipment or medication. Each of these instances, each reasonable modification request is going to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And so I'm not saying that in every instance where somebody needs help with medication or some type of medical equipment that you have to help with that. What I'm saying is that based on the particular situation, the person's disability, and how reasonable their request is, it at least needs to be considered, and in many cases there is a modification to your policy or practice that can be put into place so that that person can take transit independently. So I want to close up with a couple more slides on things to consider as we move forward. Some ongoing policy considerations. We discussed a very general problem-solving process at the beginning of my part of the presentation on how to determine what the problem is. And one good way to determine if you have a problem and what the problem is by using a customer and monitoring feedback system. And so this is, how you take your complaints, how you survey passengers as to their experience on your vehicles, possibly using monitors to come up with that information. So always good to have a customer feedback program in place. If you don't, I would suggest considering that, and certainly you can come to us if you need any help with that. We can provide you some different methods that are used at transit agencies in the country. It's also important to ensure feedback is collected regularly and tracked consistently. So this is a part of that customer monitoring program that you'll have in place. How are you getting your feedback? Are you getting it consistently? And how are you tracking it? And then if patterns emerge, you'll be able to tell what they are. If you're tracking everything regularly, then patterns are going to be much easier to see than if you're just not really paying attention to the information you have coming in. And then finally, trends can then be addressed by amending whatever policy is in place that affects that particular topic. So it's important to, 1, get the information, 2, track that information, 3, find out what trends there are, and then 4, address the problems based on the information that you have. And then finally, just a couple of do's and don'ts here, just a sort of a recap of some of the important information that I've provided. It's important to definitely solicit input from the disability community. Having input from the disability community, as I've mentioned before, will absolutely help in implementation. Having buy-in from the disability community will make that implementation much smoother. Obtain feedback from all affected parties. You want to have information from passengers and drivers and management and the community, everybody that will be affected. And then consider making regular updates to policies. As I mentioned, it's an ongoing process. It's something that you'll have to revisit likely in the future as well. And then for don't forget to advertise your new policy. People can't follow the new policy if they don't know that it exists. And then don't neglect to form an implementation timeline. So holding that timeline will help people have sort of confidence in the transit agency, and they'll know what's happening, and the implementation will be a lot more smooth. So thank you so much. I appreciate you listening to my section of the presentation. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Pat.
Thank you, Christy. Well, I'm Pat Hansen. I'm with South Central Adult Services, and I operate a multi-county transit system in South Central North Dakota. I have, with the agency, we have 7 counties, and we have 30 vehicles that are stationed in various areas throughout the region. And our entire system is demand response, which makes it a little interesting sometimes for developing policies, especially when there's a 200-mile radius of area that you're covering and different types of people and groups. And then just to give you a little idea too with the policies, we did, this last year we did 110,000 rides, and a lot of our counties are frontier counties, and a lot of those rides are 100 miles or more per ride. So, and one other thing I guess that I wanted to mention with the disabilities and the importance of ADA as far as I'm concerned is we had there was no transit provided in some of our really rural counties and their frontier counties. And we had one individual who had been in her home for 6 years, had never left her home except by ambulance because she was disabled and had no way to get out. And we deal with a lot of those types of situations where we put a very strong priority in making sure that our disabled people have service probably over and above what our general population does. So that affects some of the policies that we have. On the next slide, the policies that we've developed have been developed over a number of years. The agency has continued to grow and grow and grow, and I've been with the agency for 30 years and started back when we had 2 vehicles and I drove one of them part of the time up to the point where we're at now. And most of the time especially now, we're short-staffed and overworked, and we don't spend as much time as we should on developing policies, which I've enjoyed listening to the other speakers because it is important how you do that. But most of the time in our agency, it ends up that policies are created when something happens and corrective action is needed. So that's kind of where we're at with that. And I don't know, I'm sure that a lot of you are in the same position. I don't have a lot of input as far as fixed routes are concerned because we don't do fixed routes. Okay, and two of the sample policies that became a real issue with us, one of them was carrying wheelchairs downstairs. And I'm sure that a lot of you probably, if you're from larger systems, that's never been an issue. But when you live in a rural county where there's no one else around, and you have people that are still living in their family homes and have 5 or 10 stairs to get down in order to get down to ground level, we had over the years a lot of drivers that would actually help carry the passengers in the wheelchair down, with the wheelchair down the stairs until we had somebody get hurt. And our insurance, workman's comp did not like that because we had potential for some really big claims with the drivers, and we did have to implement a policy where the driver or the passengers now have to be at ground level when they're picked up. The other thing is our service is all door to door, so the drivers do go to the door and pick, and get the passenger and bring them to the vehicle. But it was a difficult policy because some of our people were very low income, and we did find some ways around that. And we also provide aging services. We do a big variety of services where we actually were able to have ramps built in those areas in their individual homes. But that became kind of an urgent thing when something happened, which is, like I said, it's not the best way to develop policies, but sometimes in the real world that's how it happens. Another issue that we had was restraining mobility devices in the vehicles. Like I said, a lot of our rides are over many miles at pretty high speeds, and our requirement has always been with non-ADA passengers that we require seat belts, and if they refuse to put a seat belt on, they don't ride. And we finally had to implement that in, for the passengers that were in wheelchairs also, because we had people in mobility devices that had no way to restrain them, and we gave them the option, or we give them the option now of they can either be, if they're in a device that can't be restrained, they can transfer to a regular seat, or they can transfer into a mobility device that can be restrained inside the vehicle. So, and we did try to get as much input as we could on those issues as far as the individual passengers and from like the nursing homes in the area, the people that we were really having issues with on that. We don't have, some of our communities are really small. It's a little different. You can hold a public meeting and maybe have 5 people show up, which isn't real efficient. And in most of our counties, well, in fact, 6 out of the 7 counties don't really have any active disability councils or anybody that deals with the issues. It's pretty much individuals living in their homes that we're dealing with. So, and the next slide, the process. Like I said, when the situation arises, you address it as it happens, basically. And I usually do the investigation and talk to the passengers, the drivers, anybody else that's been involved in an incident. And we try to check out the available options. One of the big things is keeping up on the federal and state regulations, which I really, I try to attend as many training options as I have, and also have the staff do that so that we're aware of what the federal and state regulations are, so that we're in compliance with those. We need to talk to the staff, and sometimes with us, because we have staff, we have 100 staff all over a large area, and it's difficult a lot of times to actually have like a staff meeting where you have everybody in one place. Doesn't happen real often. So communication is important and trying to get it out to the people that are coordinating services in those areas to meet with their staff. And then a big thing for us in this part of the world has been to talk to other operators. We have some good organizations, and we try to get involved so that when we do develop a policy or when an issue comes up, that we let each other know what's going on so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we try to do something. Once we get something put together, we make a recommendation to the board of directors, and our board, the super board, consists of membership from each of the 7 counties that we're involved with. And I also meet with each of the individual 7 county boards of directors on a quarterly basis so that they have an opportunity to bring things up that are specific to their local areas. The policy then gets voted on and passed by the board before we implement it. And obviously the next steps are to get the staff informed and trained, to get the information into the rider's guide, and to do routine checks to make sure that the policy is being followed. And it is, on the next slide, it's the passengers have to be picked up at ground level, and then all of the passengers, regardless of their status, disabled or not, be restrained in the vehicle. And on the next slide, the issues with that are enforcing the policies with the drivers, because we have drivers who were more than willing to carry passengers down the stairs and really, argued the policy for them. Well, you can't have one driver who's willing to do that, and you have passengers calling in and requesting a specific driver because they know they're not going to have to follow the rules. So part of the problem with the policies is enforcing it with the staff themselves. And in the same light, some of the drivers don't want to upset the passengers. In the smaller areas, they develop relationships with the passengers, and they, if someone said, well, I just don't want to wear a seatbelt, and they'd say, well, okay, and they'd let them. The next time you turn around, another driver tries to enforce it, and there's issues with that. So I think one of the biggest problems that we have is trying to make the enforcement consistent once the policy is developed. And I think probably the most important thing that I've learned over the years that I've been here as far as developing policies is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time something happens. There are many documents available that can be revised to meet the needs of your agency or your program. Like I said, if you have a transit association, we have the Dakota Transit Association, which serves North and South Dakota. We gather once or twice a year as a group and kind of review some of the information that we have available. Under the resources, additional resources, the state departments of transportation, and you find that it's really important, obviously, with your state to be in compliance with what their regulations are, and sometimes they may exceed what the federal regulations are. That they quite often in North Dakota, they have a lot of the policies, general policies listed on their website, and you can go in and download those and just modify those to meet your requirements. Another thing would be the Federal Transit Administration. FTA has many, many good things that you can beg, borrow, or steal from them to get the information. And then sometimes it's basically just going online and searching for things. It's so easy now when you can just Google something and a specific issue or problem, and it's amazing how many results you get of things that at least give you a starting point when you start to develop something, so you're not starting from scratch with everything that you do. The associations and local agencies, again, I find that those are quite often the best option. and then you're dealing with people that are in your own geographical area and people who do what you do. It's really hard sometimes for us with some of the other agencies that are around that don't do the same thing, and it's hard to change your policies to comply with what they're doing or to even use their policies for what you need. And then a lot of the time with the local people, they're people that you know and you've formed relationships with, so you don't feel ridiculous when someone, when you have a question that you think is a stupid question, you can ask them and not have to be feel embarrassed by having to do that. So it's a little bit more open communication. And then with the state DOTs, on the next slide, many of the states, like I said, provide templates for specific policies. One that that's not ADA per se as a policy is the drug and alcohol requirements. There's so many provisions in there that if you had to rewrite that every time and go through and find all those regulations, it's really nice that the states, most of the states provide templates for those. And then they're also helpful because they've already been reviewed and they've been approved to match FTA and state requirements. So you're not developing something that's going to get, that you're going to lose because, or have to redo over again because it doesn't meet somebody's requirements. And then FTA has a wealth of resources available, and those are free of charge. And they also have a new focus on safety and security, and that's been very beneficial to me. I did attend some of their training at CTAA a couple of years ago and got certified under their program, and a lot of their issues kind of gave me a new outlook on our policies. Some of them didn't seem like, some of the policies didn't seem like they were very relevant or important to us, but when you look at it from the viewpoint of risk management and trying to keep, prevent injuries and prevent from being sued, it's very helpful to have their information available. And I guess I had already talked about the online searches. Like I said, I've put some pretty general things in there and gotten some pretty good information that can be modified to meet the needs of what I'm looking for. And then on the last, or second to the last slide here, the websites, there's a listing there of websites that I find that are very helpful. For us, the FTA and CERTC, CTAA, and Project Action are probably the best ones. As I said, we don't do fixed route, and we're only rural. We don't use much with APTA. But for those of you who have fixed route systems or live in bigger cities, that would be a helpful resource for you. And then the last page is my contact information. If you have any questions or are interested in more information or any of the policies that we have, feel free to contact me. And I thank you for the opportunity, and I'll turn it back over to Christian.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was terrific, and it is really great to learn about the process that your local community has and your agency has for policy development. It's extremely valuable, and easy for us to kind of take that overall approach and look at it from a general sense. But the same way it's going from a discussion of ADA regulations to local policy, it's great to do that kind of general overview of a process for development, and then look at a local community. So thank you again. That was extremely helpful and a great presentation. I just wanted to take a few minutes before we jump into questions to discuss some resource guide that has been put together for this session and made available online. We can also email it to you if you would like. First are a few Easter Seals Project Action resources that I wanted to share. The primary one being a checklist for policy development, and there's a PDF version of this available on the resource guide. There's a link to it, and that's also available on the event page for this webinar. And basically that checklist just goes through a lot of what we've talked about today. So defining a focus for a policy, establishing a background for it. So what is the policy being motivated by? Identifying coordinators and a development group. So basically putting down on paper who's going to be developing this policy and who's in charge of making sure it happens. And then the checklist goes on to ensure that you're including all the different stakeholders you would need to create a fair policy. So fixed route customers, paratransit customers, customers with disabilities, customers who are served within a specific geographic location, and things like that. And then working with that kind of preliminary information, you can dive down into the weeds of actually putting together the policy and determining who's affected by it, who's impacted, and who needs to do what in order to enact that policy. So that's a helpful checklist that we've developed that you can definitely edit to suit your community's needs, but we've made it available to you today. Also, we have some webinar recordings that might be helpful to you. One is the customer service monitoring and feedback session that we did a little while back, and that was a discussion of how to best get feedback from your customers so that you can take into consideration what their experiences are and use that to shape your policies. So we encourage you to use that webinar as a resource. We also have a couple online courses that might be helpful to you. One is the Advanced Practices in Paratransit Service online course, or APPS for short. And that's geared towards paratransit managers who are a little more experienced and are kind of getting into the, beyond just the service provision, also getting their hands wet with working with issues of paratransit policy and developing a better system for their customers. So that can be a helpful course. And you can always, we offer these at least a couple of times a year, so there's usually ample opportunities to sign up. And then we also have a Fundamentals of Travel Training Administration online course, and that kind of is helpful for learning about policy development in the realm of travel training and providing travel instruction to individuals with disabilities who want to learn how to ride the fixed route independently. And policy often figures into there because you're not just teaching someone how to ride the bus, you're also sort of teaching them what their rights are and giving them some background on the different rights they have through the ADA, but also what the local policies are for the transportation service they're trying to use. Then moving into some outside resources, we've provided on this resource guide a number of TCRP reports. So that's the Transit Cooperative Research Program. And these different resources are helpful for individual policies that you might want to be forming. So for instance, that first one on Report 150 on Communication with Vulnerable Populations, a Transportation and Emergency Management Toolkit. You might very well be developing policies around emergency preparedness. Some of those might be geared towards people with disabilities. So reading through a report like this might be very helpful to you in learning what are some good things to go into a policy like that. Or for instance, the next one, Synthesis 94 on Innovative Rural Transit Services. A lot of that gets into the issues that Pat was addressing. What are things that are more specific to rural areas, providing service in rural areas? What are some policy considerations there? And then also, moving through these resources, there's Synthesis 88 addresses some of the issues Christy mentioned with securement. So strollers, carts, and other large items on buses and trains. What are some considerations to be had there in terms of policy development? And basically, these reports can be extremely in-depth and long. And part of the service that Project Action provides is having an in-house team that is very familiar with these publications. And sometimes you don't have time to sit, you're also busy, you don't have time to sit down and read a 100 or 200 page long report on these issues. So sometimes it's easier just to get in touch with us and ask us about the things in the report that we think might specifically pertain to your your situation or to your transit agency, and we can kind of glean those for you and help you out with that. So please take advantage of us for that level of technical assistance. Also, another thing that we've provided in the resource guide is the Marin Access Paratransit Riders Guide, and that's from Marin County in California. It's just a particularly good example of that second category of transit policy that I mentioned much earlier in the presentation, of a specific rider's guide that's kind of delineating out the different policies that pertain to customers with disabilities and what they need to know for what their rights are on the transit system. So I encourage you to go into the resource guide and take a look at that. Also, the resource guide has a lengthy section on examples of various policies pertaining to service animals, and these are coming from all over the country, from Philadelphia to Denver to Seattle, and so it kind of shows you the various nuances that various agencies have for their service animal policies, and that we often get questions on service animals, so I thought it might be helpful to include those. So again, this resource guide is available online, and if you are, for whatever reason, unable to access it through our website, please let us know. You can either call us at our 800 number, which we'll provide at the end of the session, or email us requests at webinars@easterseals.com, and we can send along that information. Since we've got 15 minutes left, I just wanted to go ahead and go into Q&A. So if you'd like to ask us a question, you can either use the chat box, or you can press star and then 1 on your touch-tone phone, and you'll be placed into a queue to ask questions over the phone. So go ahead, and then Pat, Christy, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Looks like we don't have any on the phone yet. I do encourage you, if you have any questions to ask relating to local policy development, you can go ahead and type those into the chat box if you'd like. Anything pertaining to some local issues that you've encountered but we may not have mentioned, anything of that nature, we're happy to answer your questions at this time.
And there are no audio questions at this time.
All right. Well, if you do think of anything, we'll be on the line for a few more minutes. You can feel free to ask us. If not, again, you can send your questions to webinars@easterseals.com, and we can get back to you with information. Well, while we're waiting for a minute, I just want to invite Christy and Pat to give any final comments you might have. Oh, actually, I'm seeing now that we have one question on the phone. Stephanie, if you could patch through.
We have a question from Rosa in Florida.
Yes, I think it's really more of a comment. Listening in on the webinar, our paratransit system recently entered into a new contract, and I think one of the biggest problems we had is that the disability community wasn't really included in the development of the contract, and so now the policy issues that are arising. Again, the community isn't being included in this, and we're in this transition period. So how do we handle this as a disability community?
Let me just make sure I understand your question, Rosa. You mentioned a contract. This is a contract between the transit agency and
the county.
Another agency providing the trips?
It's between the county and an agency to provide the trips for the community.
Okay, and so the county has then given the agency what their policies have to be, correct?
I couldn't tell you exactly because it hasn't really been published to the disability community, to the riders.
Right. That's sometimes how it works. Of course, obviously, your particular situation, we may not have all of the details here, but sometimes that's how it happens. An agency or a county or some sort of group is contracting service from another transit agency or from a transit agency, and in that contract it is spelled out to them what their requirements are. And that obviously is going to include any regulatory requirements, anything that's required by federal or state or local law, but it could also include what they would prefer or what they were going to require their policy and practice to include. And so when a contract is in place like that, it is relatively difficult to amend policy quickly. That doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means that if you're going through a contract, the agency that's delivering the service then does not have the ability to amend the policy. It must be amended, in your case, through the county. And so my suggestion as the disability community there is to try to find the person within the county that is monitoring this contract and see if it's possible to talk to them about the policy, possible to talk to them about the procedure that they actually go through to amend policy, because they do have to update the contract that they have with this transit agency every so often. There's going to be a requirement for them to bid out that contract every so many years. And so at that time it might be the easiest time to update policy and procedure. But they may also have intermediate times in which case they can look at some of the policy that that they're requiring the agency to follow. So that would really be the place to start if you wanted to talk policy and practice, is the agency that monitors that contract.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
There are no additional questions at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. If you have any questions, you can feel free to type them into the chat. There is one question here asking, when issues arise that are addressed on a case-by-case basis, are these policies necessary to be in writing? That's coming from Kim Stewart.
I assume, Christian, that what she means is the modification policy and practice. Yeah, so no, it's not required to be in writing in those cases. At least it's not legally required.
Yeah, and Kim, if you're asking about reasonable modification, so in other words, things that arise that, okay, said yes. So yeah, it's not required. So I hope we answered your question. And again, we have a couple more minutes, so if anyone has a question they'd like to call in, please do so. Otherwise, type it into the chat. And again, we're more than happy to take them following the session as well. All right. Well then, Pat or Christy, unless you have any final comments you'd like to offer, then I think we can go ahead and close out the session.
I'll just say thank you very much to everybody for participating today. And as Christian has said a few times, please feel free to give us a call or an email if you have questions. These types of policy amendment and development questions we handle frequently, and we're happy to assist you if we can.
And I would like to thank you for having me involved in this, and it was very interesting, and thank you.
Thank you, Pat, for joining us and for that great presentation.
All right, well, thank you again to all of our presenters, to Christian, to Christy, and to Pat. We, as Christian has said, are more than happy to take your questions through our 800 line as well. If you come up with some perhaps later on that come to mind following the presentation, please give us a call. Our phone number again is 1-800-659-6428. Also, we very much appreciate your feedback on our events. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to tell us how you feel about the effectiveness of this event by completing a brief evaluation, there's a link that has now appeared on the screen. This will also be emailed to all of you, and that will bring you to a very short survey. Again, your feedback to us helps us to ensure that our events going forward are the most effective that they can be. Once again, I'll thank all of our presenters for today's excellent session. Thanks to all of you in the audience for participating, and to Stephanie, our Better World operator. I'd ask you to please watch our website as well, projectaction.org, and your email for future Easter Seals Project Action events, webinars, and the like. And most importantly, as always, thank you for your commitment to increasing and improving accessible transportation in your communities. With that, have a good day and a good afternoon.
Thank you. This concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect. Speakers, please hold the line.